Hello, I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing at the University of Oxford to probe battery interface growth through ultra-thin film electrodes. The first thing that I want to talk about is how batteries work. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with batteries, and you're probably looking at this very video on a device that contains a battery. And the general principle of operation is that we take a material rich in lithium as the cathode, and we have an electrolyte and a separator which allows lithium ions only through but not electrons. And then we intercalate these lithium ions into an anode material. Now, by discharging the battery and shuttling these lithium ions across from the cathode to the anode, we force electrons to go externally round a circuit to power your device. Now, in order to try and maximize the energy that we can get out of batteries, we tend to use materials, both the anode and the cathode, that are a little bit unstable in contact with the electrolyte. And what that allows us to do is maximize the energy difference between the lithium ions in the cathode layer and the lithium ions in the anode layer. Now, the downside of this is that there's an inherent instability, and you form these interphase layers, both at the cathode electrolyte interface and the anode electrolyte interface. And trying to understand how this interface grows and the materials that are developed is really very key to getting the most out of batteries. Some of the materials that we can use for the future of battery materials involve solid electrolytes and utilising alkali metal anodes. Now, alkali metals can allow us to store a lot more lithium than something which stores like an LMO or an NMC material, which only stores a little bit of lithium. So it gives us the most energy density possible. In reality, these solid electrolytes have a real roughness, so there's this to consider versus a commercial liquid electrolyte cell. The other thing is the inherent nature of lithium is it's very, very reactive. You tend to form these hydroxide and carbonate species on the surface. And as I mentioned, when you bring these two things together, you don't get an intimate contact across the whole surface, but when you do get contact, you get some interfacial products. And these interfacial products, they may even evolve with cycling as we charge and discharge our battery over many, many cycles, which is why your phone battery doesn't have the same life it does now as when you bought it brand new. So in order to try and understand these interfacial layers and how they grow and what they're composed of, we use X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. And here is an image of the XPS system we have in Oxford. It's got a lithium evaporation system here. There's a transfer arm to move things into the main chamber, and the hemispherical analyzer and ion guns just allow us to understand the photoelectrons that come off and to do some level of surface preparation. Now, XPS is one of the most fundamentally useful techniques in all of surface science. By bringing in an incoming photon of energy h nu, we can have that photon absorbed by the material by a core level electron, which then promotes and ionizes to give it a kinetic energy Ke here. And so this kinetic energy that we measure inside the hemispherical analyzer can ultimately be used to calculate what the binding energy was of the electron that absorbed that photon. By finding out that binding energy, we can work out what chemical species generated that photoelectron. So we can tell the difference not just between elements such as carbon, oxygen and fluorine, but we can find the difference between carbons bound to fluorines and other carbons. So it's a really valuable tool in the arsenal of battery chemists. In the case of trying to understand the interface between the anode and the electrolyte, we need to start considering the possibility of looking through an alkali metal anode. Now, you can do this with depth profiling by utilizing X-rays of different energies. In the case of the red X-ray, which has a slightly lower energy, we promote photoelectrons that have a slightly slower kinetic energy. And so they don't come from within the deepest parts of the material because the electrons are scattered by the matter that they are traveling through. In the case of the blue photoelectrons that are generated from the higher energy blue photons, they come from a deeper layer. And so we can probe a deeper part of our interface. And as I say, if we evaporate some lithium onto our material and it's a thin enough layer, we can probe through that lithium layer to understand the reactions that are going on at our electrolyte anode interface. So if we want to look at some of the experimental data we've collected for this in collaboration with the Diamond synchrotron at Beamline IO9, we've got 3 different X-ray energies that we used with probing depths for their photoelectrons of about 3 nanometers for the red, 18 nanometers for the black, and 60 nanometers for the green lines. For the bare pellet that you can see, all of the data is fairly consistent across all of the different core levels, the oxygen, the carbon, the sulfur, and the lithium. The main difference comes with this carbon adventitious peak, where we can see that there's a lot more of the adventitious carbon signal relative to the rest of the carbon peak at 3 nanometers, telling us that this is just from species that have absorbed hydrocarbons from the atmosphere onto the surface of our electrolyte. We can also see there is some lithium carbonate on the bare pellet. As we evaporate lithium onto our solid electrolyte, this Li6PS5Cl agirodite electrolyte, we can see that the peaks change drastically across all core levels. At the lithium, we see the presence of this lithium metal peak here at about 52 electron volts. And we can also see some new reactive species due to lithium oxide and lithium sulfide. And the ratios of these 2 peaks vary as we look at different depths within our surface. We can see the presence of lithium sulfide here in the sulfur as we've changed from this doublet corresponding to the pristine material, ending up with a doublet of doublets, or 2 sets of doublets that overlap, giving us a 3-peaked structure. If we do this evaporation and transfer it into a glove box or through a glove box, we see that we actually lose all of this metallic species from the lithium altogether because of the high reactivity of the lithium metal. We also see a passivation of the sulfur species and significantly large quantities of carbonate species in both the carbon and the oxygen signals with the carbonates here. And so this really does highlight the need for studying these interfaces with in situ deposition methods. So these in situ deposition methods we have available at Oxford are as follows. We can consider looking at the bare pellet and then evaporating some lithium metal onto it. We can also sputter some argon ions at a lithium target mounted next to the pellet inside the XPS chamber and look at the change in the chemistry as we layer more and more lithium onto that surface. And finally, we can use a virtual electrode approach where we put lithium on the bottom side, use an electron gun to make the top surface negative and draw lithium ions through to start plating at the top of the electrolyte. And just a little bit of data here now showing the effect of each of these different deposition methods for the lithium. So in the far right hand corner we can see that all 3 cases deposit lithium metal onto our surface, and all 3 see the species formed in the lithium oxide and lithium sulfide regions, as we can see a clear change from the carbonate and the agirodite peaks in the bare case of the grey line. We can see that there's attenuation of this sulfur peak as we are covering it with lithium layers. The lab-based aluminium source has only about 10 nanometer probing depth for a lithium film. So this is telling us that our lithium layers deposited in all 3 cases are about 10 nanometers in thickness because we can barely see the sulfur underneath it. The same is true with the chlorine, and we can see the sulfur changing from this agirodite sulfur, which is fully attenuated, to this lithium sulfide peak here. And the phosphorus has also undergone some chemical changes. There are some subtle differences between the different deposition methods in that we get slightly different ratios of hydroxide, carbonate and oxide on the lithium, on the oxygen species, and we also see slightly different amounts of adventitious carbon, but you can read more about that in the recent paper in Faraday Discussions. So I'd like to thank the people involved in funding this research, the Henry Royce Institute for their capital investment in the Oxford group, the Diamond Light Source for their awarding of the beam time, and the Faraday Institution characterization project for the lithium evaporation study. If you'd like to know more about the equipment that we have available through Royce at Oxford, you can utilise this email address here, or you can contact us in other ways shown here.